So the path of moving in this direction, of obstacles being our teachers and a life teaching us and life waking us up rather than becoming more and more of a burden and more depressing and us becoming more and more discouraged, is really fundamentally learning to stay. Learning to stay with a good sense of humor, learning to stay with loving kindness towards yourself and the outer situation, bringing in as much warmth and gentleness into the equation. Learning to stay is the basis of humility, because if you see your own mind, it's impossible to be arrogant. It's the basis of compassion, because as I've often said in the past, the more you stand in your own shoes, the more you learn to stay and recognize Shempa and really get the taste and smell of Shempa and realize what human beings are up against with that urge and that drive and that wish to move away and how strong it is. Once you experience that in yourself, and then you begin to have enormous compassion for the crazy antics of other people, because you understand that they're just up against what you're up against. They have Shempa, and they have these urges and these cravings, and they probably have received no instruction. And even if they have, like you have, do you always get it right? So instead of becoming like perfect at this, it humbles you, it causes you to have a lot of compassion for the human condition, other people's dilemmas. You see someone else stuck, and instead of automatically being irritated, there's more and more recognition of what they're up against and how hard it is. And it motivates you to just work with yours and not be so critical of other people's, and not so critical of yours either, but just working with yours. Friendly attention to the whole thing and a sense of warmth, but nevertheless, you do interrupt the momentum of the Shenpa, because otherwise it gets stronger all the time and the work gets harder and harder. The ability to stay present, to stay with an open heart and an open mind just gets harder and harder. So we have to interrupt that momentum to move away. And that's what we're doing when we touch the thoughts lightly. And as they say, touching them is the letting go. And to just reiterate again, it isn't the thoughts that are the problem, because if that was the case, we'd be somewhat doomed, since the thoughts are somewhat part of mind. Thoughts in the mind are like waves in water. Sometimes the water is still, but you're never going to get still water forever. And often the waves get huge, and sometimes they're just little ripples. But that's the image for the nature of our minds. So there has to be a way that we allow that the thinking will happen forever, and that we work with the Shenpa, the hooked quality. And I'm sure that many of us don't really know the distinction, but you find out for yourself, and you can actually. And actually no one else can find out for you, and no one else can tell you. It has to be you that sees. So I remember waking up in the morning, and then there was some like major Shenpa attack. I'm not even out of bed yet, you know. Actually, waking up in the morning, and definitely in the evening when it's starting to get dark, can be especially vulnerable times. So you wake up and the Shenpa is already there, you know. And I just had this thought. When Shenpa arises for me, sheer delight. And that sort of liberated it. In other words, that thought of this is the very material of sheer delight allowed me, I laughed and I didn't go down the road. So in a way, as much lightness as we can bring into this process, because the tendency to struggle with ourselves is so strong, and we're all going to get into a lot of struggles, just the way you get into struggles with thinking. And you go from extremes of trying not to think, and that's a struggle, and then you say, to hell with it, and you just let it go, and you just say, I'm just going to think. And then, so you go to the other extreme, and then you say, okay, now I'm going to have a little discipline, and then you struggle, and it just goes back and forth like ping pong ball. So at that moment in the morning, and since then, just the thought of this teaching, without trying to live up to it or something, helped to lighten it up and interject some humor into it and some sense of really, I make this into a problem. I mean, we could say that even Shenpa is not a problem, except that we have to have some way to interrupt the momentum of what it is that keeps us ignorant, what keeps us not seeing. So there has to be some way to talk about it so that we realize that we don't see clearly and we could see clearly. And we can go from ignorance to learning to stay, learning to see. There's this practice that some of you have done with me or do on your own, which is called one in the beginning and one in the end. And what this is when you wake up in the morning, you make your aspiration for the day, or aspirations. People do it in a very, very personalized way. But just to give an example, you might say, may I catch my Shenpa today? Try not to make it too grandiose. May I completely attain enlightenment by noon. You know, may I make it to the breakfast table without blowing up at somebody? You know, that might be a good one. You know, you're pretty realistic here. But basically, you make your aspiration, and they change day by day, and sometimes they're very glorious and sometimes very mundane. But, you know, there's some sense of living your life as a ceremony, that you begin with a sense of intention, and then you go about your day. And needless to say, there's always a lot of forgetfulness about this intention. But in any case, that's one at the beginning. And one at the end is at the end of the day, you look back over. This is the part that is so loaded for people like ourselves. Because looking back over, you go into despair mode about what a failure you are. So when Zikr Kunchal teaches about this, he always says, for me, when I see that I connected with my aspiration, even briefly, once during the whole day, I feel a sense of rejoicing. And he said, and when I see that I blew it, lost it completely, I rejoice that I have the capacity to see that. For him, what he tries so hard to teach the students, and what he says is the most challenging thing to teach, is what is it, after all, that sees that we blew it? It's your own wisdom, it's your own insight, it's your own prajna. Couldn't we just have the aspiration to identify with the wisdom that sees that we said a mean word, or that we drank when we said we wouldn't drink, or whatever it is, the wisdom that sees that we identify more and more with this prajna, or this wisdom aspect of our being, instead of always identifying with the failure that's being seen. So he said, so when I see that I didn't live up to it, that I blew it, I rejoice that I have that ability to see. So this is a very, very important point, you see. And again, hopefully I say this to get us into the spirit of delighting in seeing rather than despairing in seeing. This is the point I'm trying to make. Is that clear that that's the point I'm trying to make? Is delighting in seeing rather than despairing in seeing. Letting seeing build confidence rather than cause us to go into a depression and feel discouraged and hopeless. This is the point that he makes over and over again in his teachings. Being able to acknowledge the Shenpa, being able to see the Shenpa, that is the doorway to freedom. Just being able to acknowledge it, being able to see it. And we should be able to rejoice in that. Then if we can do the next step of refraining from going down the road, which sometimes we'll be able to do, and sometimes we won't be able to do, depending on the strength of the Shenpa, we should rejoice that sometimes we have that ability to interrupt the momentum of the Shenpa. And we should rejoice that we even have the aspiration to acknowledge and to refrain. And we should expect relapses. We should just expect relapses, you know? 5 steps forward, 5 steps back. 5 steps forward, 4.5 steps back. Yay! 4.5 steps. like my daughter is in Weight Watchers, and it's a good thing, this Weight Watchers, because they're told that they're going to go up and down, that it's not always going to be lose, 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 lose. And they should go slow, and when they gain in a week, no big deal. You know, look at it from a bigger perspective, like what happens in a whole month or what happens in a 3-month period. If you just stay with the program, so to speak, there's this gradual losing. Whereas if you just throw up your hands because you binge dieted for a week and lost 5 pounds, and then the next week gained 8, no big deal. So you take a bigger perspective. And it's sort of like that with meditation, working with our minds. We have to realize that definitely there's going to be relapses. When things are going really well and you've had sort of breakthrough experiences, you say, well, every other time this has happened, I fall flat on my face. I wonder if it'll happen this time. And it usually does. There's like this spiritual backlash, you know. And Trungpa Rinpoche actually used to teach about this. And what he said is, if you just had smooth sailing, and it was just like Shenpas dropping right and left, continually, week after week, just shedding those Shenpas, and just like, no problem. Oh, a little sticky this week, but, you know, I just conquered that one and everything. He says, you get so obnoxious and so uncompassionate about other people who can't shed their Shenpas. So he said, for the spiritual journey, life will always give us the perfect balance of humbling us with failure, so-called, and actually more space in our mind, bigger perspective on what's happening, more ease with ourselves. He called it the balance of gloriousness and wretchedness. And he said they educated us. So if it was just all gloriousness, like one success after another, we'd get extremely arrogant and completely out of touch with the human situation, what people are up against. On the other hand, if it's just all wretchedness, and there's never any space or openness, if we never experience insights, experience of our own wisdom, then you get so terribly discouraged. So the truth is that they do balance themselves. They do. And as a species, especially North American species, we tend to always overemphasize the wretchedness. So for instance, when you reviewed your day, if you try to do that practice, it's very common with Western students that it all looks bleak, like didn't get anything right. And then maybe if there's somebody, you know, a partner that you live with or somebody else, they say, well, what about the fact that you were getting all worked up and you actually went out for a walk and came back calmed down? Or I saw you smile at that man who was sitting on the corner all crumpled over and depressed, and I saw him brighten up. And, you know, sometimes other people have to tell us. Not to mention the fact that maybe we had some moments of happiness, of seeing something that really pleased us, something that really touched us, where we contacted tenderness of our hearts. So as Western people, we can kind of expect that we're going to look on the dark side. So it's important during the day to really notice when you do feel happiness or when something happens, and begin to sort of cherish those things as very, very precious, so that gradually you can begin to have a sense of cherishing the preciousness of your whole life, with its ups and downs and its failures and successes and its rough and smooths. It's very important to see what we do. And what Zigor Control always says is, if you begin to see what you do, you see the Shenpa, and you're working with it in your practice, say like the basic practice that underlies all practice, learning to stay. When you see it and then the momentum is getting very strong with the thoughts, and you interrupt them with the label thinking, just so that you're cutting the momentum of the Shenpa, you come back to the breath, which is like learning to stay in the present moment with the underlying energy. If you aspire to work that way, in meditation and in post-meditation, which is the rest of your life, to catch the Shenpa and to remember to practice, you know, at that point, there's no way that your life will not be gradually, perhaps imperceptibly transformed, so that when you look back, you begin to see. The only way I ever know that anything has happened is look back, because I never get gratified by peak experiences or breakthroughs or something. It never happens to me. I've always wanted it to happen, and never has. And I still want it to happen, but I'm beginning to realize that it doesn't matter, because people tell me their stories constantly, and breakthrough experiences don't always add up to much. It's very important to see what we do. And what Zigor Control always says is, if you begin to see what you do, you see the Shenpa, and you're working with it in your practice, say like the basic practice that underlies all practice, learning to stay. When you see it, and then the momentum is getting very strong with the thoughts, and you interrupt them with the label thinking, just so that you're cutting the momentum of the Shenpa. You come back to the breath, which is like learning to stay in the present moment with the underlying energy. If you aspire to work that way, in meditation and in post-meditation, which is the rest of your life, to catch the Shenpa and to remember to practice, at that point, there's no way that your life will not be gradually, perhaps imperceptibly transformed, so that when you look back, you begin to see. The only way I ever know that anything has happened is look back, because I never get gratified by peak experiences or breakthroughs or something. It never happens to me. I've always wanted it to happen, and never has. And I still want it to happen, but I'm beginning to realize that it doesn't matter, because people tell me their stories constantly, and breakthrough experiences don't always add up to much. They come and they tell me something, and I think, wow, wish I experienced that. And then the next day, they're completely hooked by some Shenpa, And so gradual is good. At least I keep telling myself. No, it really is. It is good. And so that's fortunate, since it is extremely gradual. It's like willing to lose half a pound a week until you've lost the 150 pounds you need to lose, rather than try to lose 20 pounds a week and keep adding it back all the time. It stays off, as I say. And the main thing is this aspiration. So the point that Zigor Control makes is that until you begin to train in seeing and staying so that you can see the Shenpas and working with them, he said, then basically what's going to happen is life is going to always be hooking you. Little things are going to be just throwing you for a loop, right and left, just out of the blue, like people throwing rocks at your head. The slightest thing basically triggers you, and you're off and running. And it just gets stronger and stronger. He says life just becomes more and more confusing, more and more of a struggle, more and more of a burden, because you've never looked at the root cause, which is the Shenpa, and therefore you're getting just triggered, right and left, triggered all the time. Once you start seeing, you still get triggered because that's what you see, but there's something different, the magic of seeing. It's sort of like Thich Nhat Hanh talking about the miracle of mindfulness. It's the miracle of learning to stay, being present with the Shenpa, knowing it's happening. The more you do it, the more your ability to be able to do it grows. And the ability to see more and more subtle levels just naturally begins to happen. That's not something you have to force. It just naturally happens that there's less and less self-deception and less ability to hide out. When I really get hooked and I'm starting to get all worked up, I do something which I call teaching myself the Dharma. And sometimes this really helps. And that is, I might say to myself, if I follow this, what will be the result? The habituation of strengthening this pattern, what will be the result? What will be happening to me in a year's time, in 2 years' time? This pain I'm trying to get away from will be more. And so that inspires me to do the tough work of staying with disagreeable feelings of unease. Someone was telling me that she teaches herself the Dharma in order to stay present. And she said it was sort of like her own Dharma. She said, this is like childbirth. She has 2 children. She said, this is like childbirth. It's very, very painful, but it's worth going through it because it will give birth to something that I want, rather than me avoiding it and the whole nightmare of staying year after year after year. So all of this is like a pep talk to encourage you when you start denigrating yourself and beating yourself up because you see how stupid you are, how confused you are, how hooked you are. Just rejoice that you can see that, and you don't have to add these labels of bad and stupid and all of this, but you just see it. And that becomes the doorway to liberation because you're not strengthening the pattern. So teaching yourself the Dharma is very helpful. Then another thing I think is very helpful is this realization of what is it that sees, and some confidence that you have the wisdom to see what's going on, the wisdom to see the confusion, the wisdom to see the Shenpa. Because believe me, the ego or the self-absorption hates seeing. Ignorance and avoiding the present, learning to exit is the definition of the ego. It's all about not being present. It's all about staying ignorant. It's all about not knowing and not fully experiencing. So it's our wisdom that sees. And we all can do it, just the way we can all listen to the sound of the gong, at least for a second. We have that open awareness. We have that space in our mind. We can do it. And the more you have confidence in that and sort of cherish it instead of emphasizing the negative part, as if it was a little child you were trying to nurture and encourage and bring up, to have confidence in yourself, you nurture this wisdom aspect of yourself, this ability to see. There's an interesting story about the Dalai Lama, which I found really, what Ziger Control. There's an interesting story about the Dalai Lama, which I found really very helpful too. He was meeting with Western teachers, and Sharon Salzberg was explaining about that in the Western audience, everyone is taking whatever you're teaching and somehow using it against themselves. Instead of to liberate themselves, they use it as, I'm not living up, I can't do it, just another tool against themselves. And he didn't understand what she was talking about. And then she tried to explain, and he just couldn't understand. So he went around the room of all the Western teachers and asked them, and they all said, of course we know what she's talking about. This is what we're like in the West. We have a lot of everything from self-hatred to just low self-esteem, but there's a lot of feeling bad about ourselves. If you're teaching to a Western audience, you have to know that it's being filtered through that. So the Dalai Lama initially was just completely floored by that. He said, so there is a difference then between Tibetans and Western people because we have no idea of self-hatred. There's some confidence in the Buddha nature or the basic goodness. And of course, people are also neurotic, and they have a lot of Shenpa, and they do all these things, but they don't have this little twist. For instance, someone told me about getting depressed, but they didn't have the label depression. And so it was just a very, very difficult time, like being in a dark place, but it didn't have that added ammunition of I'm bad. That part wasn't there. Do you know the book, some of you maybe have read this book called The Art of Happiness by the Dalai Lama and a therapist, Cutler. So the therapist met with the Dalai Lama over a period of a few years and had a lot of different interviews with him and asked him all the hard questions that an American psychologically oriented person would ask, and he's a very intelligent man, and the Dalai Lama responded. So one day they're having a conversation about guilt and shame, and by this time the Dalai Lama heard a lot about it. So the interviewer said, do you have anything in your life that you feel bad about that you've done? He said, oh yes, many things. He said, for example, an elderly monk came to me and asked me about doing these yogic practices, which require a lot of physical exercises, sort of designed for 18-year-olds. And I advised him against it because I said I thought he was too old. And he seemed to take that well, and he left. And then I heard that he had committed suicide. Because of his belief system, he thought if he committed suicide, he'd get a younger body, and then he could do the exercises. So the Dalai Lama was left with the regret that he really, unintentionally, nevertheless, had been responsible for this man's death, this man's suicide. The interviewer was stopped in his tracks, and then he said, "Oh my goodness, how did you ever get rid of that feeling?" And the Dalai Lama paused for quite a long time. He thought about that, and then I didn't. It's still there. I didn't. It's still there. He said, I just don't allow it to drag me down and pull me back. I was so struck by that. I just don't allow it to drag me down and pull it back. But it was still there. So you see, we have this idea that you either have it or you get rid of it. And the question came from that point of view. He paused and he really thought about it, and then he said, I didn't get rid of it. It's still here. And Trungpa Rinpoche used to talk about that. He said, being able to hold the sorrow of the world in your heart while never forgetting what he called the Great Eastern Sun, which is the big vision, the bigger perspective, the global perspective, the sense of unlimited time and space. So some sense of being able to be pierced to the heart by your own suffering and the suffering of others and of your own regrets without it dragging you down. And then he said, and I realized that being dragged down by it or held back by it would be in no one's benefit, not mine or anybody else's. So I go forward and just do the best I can, which is pretty damn good. But I think we could all feel that he is the great teacher he is and communicates the way he does to unlimited audiences who have no background in the way he was trained or in Buddhism or anything, just right across the boards. And so I think you could say that it's because he has his own things. It's not like he's gone untouched. No sadness, no regrets. But he doesn't turn it into what we call guilt, this kind of negative shame that drags you down and makes you feel bad about yourself, and then basically you become very powerless to help yourself or anybody else. So I think that's a helpful story in terms of we're not really trying to get rid of something, we're trying to learn to stay. And it pierces you to the heart, humbles you, awakens compassion, actually makes you more tender and more open. Those of you who have experienced great